Oh, okay. Need to clean up my act. Thank you.
Well, hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. We're going to give people just another minute to join the program this evening. Um, and I will start off by mentioning that our next program in this series is coming up very quickly. And we've been doing these once a month. But because National Cave and Karst Week is happening in the beginning of June, we're doing June's program on June 2nd. So don't let it catch you off guard and sign up for that program right away so you don't miss it.
Mhm.
Looks like we're having a good amount of participants coming in. So I will go ahead and get started. So thank you again for joining us tonight. My name is Aviva O'Neill. I'm the Executive Director for Great Basin National Park Foundation. We've been doing these monthly programs so that we can connect people from wherever they live to Nevada's National Park, Great Basin National Park, during this 40th anniversary year. And the park will have its actual anniversary date in October. So we'll be doing these each month through October. If you've missed some of the previous programs and you'd like to see them, the recordings are on our YouTube channel. And Claire, who works with me, will be sending out a follow-up after this program with some of those links to the next program and to the recordings of programs. We're really excited for this program tonight. We feel really grateful to have the panelists and the moderator with us. Very special people that have done an enormous amount of good things for conservation and are going to share, not only their story, but other aspects of conservation that they worked alongside. Designating a national park, of course, it takes a lot of people. So all those of you in the audience tonight, if we happen to not mention something that you care about or you know about, you can feel free to put it in the chat. We can't kind of in an hour go over every bit of history. So we're going to look at the story that we can look at and celebrate tonight. So during this program, if you would like to ask a question or if you'd like to share something, you can do that either in the chat or the Q&A. We'll be monitoring both of those. The Q&A is a little bit easier for us to monitor. So if you can find that, please use that. But if not, go ahead and put it in the chat. And right now, to get started, if you feel like putting in the chat where you're from or why you love Great Basin or something you're interested in for tonight, please do. It's always fun to see some interaction from the audience. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Graham. Graham has been a mentor to me, and I'm really thrilled that he said yes when I asked if he would moderate this program. He's a leader of conservation in Nevada and other places. And so without further ado, I'm just going to turn it over to Graham.
Great. Thank you, Aviva, and welcome everybody who's joined us this evening. Thanks for sharing your late afternoon or evening with us, assuming you're in time zones close to us. And Aviva and the Great Basin National Park Foundation, thank you very much for the work you do on behalf of the park. So again, just to frame it again, so this is the 40th anniversary. Congress passed the Great Basin National Park Act of 1986 on October 27th, 1986. It was a 77,180 acres of diverse ecosystems, including portions of the South Snake Range, Wheeler Peak, and obviously the well-known ancient Briscoe pine groves. So tonight's panel, I'll do a brief introduction and then we'll turn to each of them to respond to one of the questions. Again, as Aviva mentioned, please put comments or questions into the chat. And we'll start by introducing Senator Richard Bryan, or Dick Bryan, as he's known to many, who served as Nevada's governor from 1983 to 1989, and then as our U.S. Senator from 89 until 2001. In the spring of 1986, when campaigning for his second term as governor, Dick Bryan, speaking in White County, came out in favor of the national park, which was I think, a critical step in terms of indicating the support from the then governor. And to this day, he remains active on the Great Basin National Park Foundation Advisory Board. Kai Anderson is currently Chief Executive Officer of Cassidy and Associates, which is a firm that specializes in legislative and public affairs in Washington, D.C. He also has a distinguished career serving Senator Harry Reid in a number of roles, including as Deputy Chief of Staff, and prizes his work on conservation land designations in Nevada, which increased protection of more than 2.5 million acres. Kai was born in Eastern Oregon, I should say, and as a young geology student participated on the Stanford Geological Surveys, where he completed 2 years of field work in the Shell Creek and South Snake Range in the park area. Neil Cornsey is a senior vice president at Cassidy Associates and also has a long and distinguished career working in conservation, land, wildlife, and energy issues, both on Capitol Hill with Senator Reid and others, as well as the Department of the Interior and for private foundations. Neil also served as the director of the Bureau of Land Management during the Obama administration. Of course, he was a mere 8 years old living in Elko, Nevada when the Great Basin National Park was designated, but ultimately did work on some additional designations and protections around the park while he was on Senator Reid's staff. And finally, on our panel, Becky Mills, who served as superintendent of Great Basin National Park from 1995 to 2002, and during her time as supervisor also assisted Bonnie Bryan, the senator's good wife, in establishing Great Basin National Park Foundation, a private not-for-profit that supports the park and its activities. Becky is now happily retired, though is busy supporting the foundation and its work. So thank you to our panelists. I'd like each of you, and we'll go in that same order if we could, to provide your perspective on the establishment of the park, including major players, surprising champions, groups that were for and against, and how those conflicts were navigated. So, Senator, if you could begin, please.
There's quite a history there, as some of those on the panel are more familiar with than I, but my first recollection of any discussion of this is Alan Bible. He was our senior senator and enjoyed a reputation as being a great advocate for national parks, recreation areas. And I had known Senator Bible. He and my father were classmates on the debate team at the University of Nevada in the late 20s and early 30s. And I knew that he was interested in pressing forward with a national park at the Great Basin. And my recollection is that, his colleague, Senator Cannon, was supportive. At that time, Nevada had only one congressional representative. And my understanding always was that Congressman Bering was then supported, but when he got to the altar, he changed his mind. And that, I'm trying to be very nice, Becky, please, and that was a devastating blow. And I think it's important for those that are participating by phone or whatever. Rural Nevada has always been very reluctant to have the federal government involved in anything. Sometimes it's not altogether consistent with what they're asking us to do. But so, in earlier times, during Senator Bible's tenure, they were very adverse to this. And for the people who don't know about Nevada, rural Nevada essentially develops its economic base from the land, farming, ranching, and they're less affected, I guess, by this. Increasingly, Nevada, Clark and Washoe County in particular, have come to recognize what wonderful assets they are, not only to the community, but to the state, and those values that we need to protect. As a Nevadan, I always resented the fact that the only thing they thought of Nevada is this vast wasteland. And that came to focus with the proposal to bury high-level nuclear waste, which is another issue in Nevada. And, look, if the place was good enough to drop atomic bombs, yeah, why not put nuclear waste there? And that was kind of a perception that there wasn't really anything. And as a Nevadan, I resented that. And the national park was kind of like an environmental conservation, you know, good seal of approval that Nevada is much more than the perception that they have.
Thank you, Senator Bryan. Kai, if I could ask you the
Yeah.
same.
Sure. So I joined Senator Reid after designation of Great Basin National Park. I was a freshman in high school when it happened, so I came late. But as somebody who's paid a lot of attention to various conservation designations in Nevada, I think if you look at the last 100 years, which is about the same, about 100 years ago, was when the first rumblings about a Great Basin National Park started, or a national park in Nevada started. Uh, the conservation landscape in the state can be divided into two parts. It's pre-park and post-park. And the reason I say that is, and I'll talk a little bit about the folks that were involved in the particular uh, establishment of the park, but Senator Bryan alluded to some of the folks who came earlier, folks like Vale Pittman, who were supportive well before the park actually got designated. Um, Reid, Senator Reid received a lot of credit for Great Basin National Park designation, and deservedly so, because I think without him, the Congress wouldn't have passed the Establishment Bill in 1986. But it's important to note that it was the product of 6 decades of on again, off again legislative work, dreaming, scheming, conflict, um, tension, missed opportunities over time. And as I was preparing for this event, I was thinking through what it must have been like to be one of those advocates over multiple generations working on it. Folks like Darwin Lambert have uh, uh, put that to writing in Great Basin Drama, his great book on the creation of the park, and that's worth a read for those of you that can find it. Good luck on that front. It's out of print, but it's a fantastic book. Um, so if we go to the Reid part of this story, the park proposal first piqued his interest when he was busy working on a Forest Service wilderness bill. He wasn't working on a park bill. And in what I sort of view as a characteristic act of violent pragmatism, as he sensed potential for a deal, he pivoted to focus on the park proposal. He put his finger on the desire for a park in White Pine County and around the state. And to Senator Bryan's point, in places like Las Vegas and Reno, right, who wanted to have a park to be proud of. It was a tough deal to do. People had been at it for 6 decades, and he basically did it in a year and a half. He did it in a manner that, in retrospect, I think foreshadowed how he would operate on land issues for the following 30 years after that, until he retired. He would negotiate, he'd compromise, he'd take what he could get, and he'd come back for the rest of it later. That was just sort of how he did things. In fact, he pivoted back to the Forest Service Wilderness Bill just 3 years later and passed it in 1989. But while we recognize Reid's role, I think it's also really important to point out that the other members of the Nevada delegation on both sides of the aisle that made this happen, starting with Senator Bryan, then governor, who was running for re-election and campaigned on the park, even in White Pine County, right? He believed in it. He wanted it. And honestly, if the governor of the state had been against it, I don't think it would have happened. Had Senator Paul Laxalt, who was famously close to President Reagan, desired for the bill to die, the park would not have been created in 1986. Ronald Reagan would have made sure that didn't happen. The same can be said for Senator Hecht. He put out a Hecht-Laxalt version of the designation bill that was much smaller than the one that Reed had introduced. And sometimes, in the legislative arena, that's done to sort of delay and slow walk something to death. But Senator Hecht worked on it. And I think maybe the most underrated person historically in this drama was Congressman Vukanovich, who represented Northern Nevada, who was keenly interested in the rancher and miner perspective. And, you know, she wasn't going to win a vote in the House, but again, I suspect had she been in all-out war on this, the bill probably would not have passed. And so, those folks all participated, and by virtue of the Vukanovich Heck Laxalt Republican triumvirate, they focused on changes to the management, right? Requiring that grazing continue, that acreage were modified, boundaries were adjusted, but it was in a spirit of compromise. It wasn't in a fashion that killed the bill. And Reed, to his credit, was willing to take less than a full loaf, right? He negotiated, he compromised, he took what he could get, and he said he'd come back and get the rest of it later, should that be necessary. And, I think that's a great masterclass in constructive engagement around compromise on public lands. And, honestly, Nevada is the state that has probably done the best job of that in the years since the designation of Great Basin National Park. And that sort of willingness to work across the aisle and together from a Nevada perspective to create something that, as Senator Laxalt said, I'd like to see us have a national park, and I think that's the right location for it, right? That coming together across the aisle paved the way for the passage later of Senator Bryan's great Southern Nevada Public Lands Management Act.
Yep.
And then some complicated bills that were done in 2002, 2004, 2006, and 2022 in specific counties, Clark, Lincoln, White Pine, and Churchill, respectively, that frankly haven't been done anywhere else in the West. And as the West has become more polarized, Nevada has remained an outlier. It's not to say there's not partisan politics in the state, but it is to say that the delegation over time, in all of its configurations, Democrats and Republicans, pre and post Reed, pre and post Bryan, has done a pretty remarkable job. And that started with Great Basin National Park and the success in 1986.
Thank you, Kai. Neil, you're on mute right now. There you go.
Yeah. So my involvement here comes a little later, as you noted. So in 2005, 2006, Senator Reed and Kai and Senator Bryan had Senator Ensign over time had started this tradition of working on county public land bills, and I was the staff working for Senator Reed on White Pine County. And so, I would travel out to the state as often as I could. We would sit down with ranchers, county commissioners, mayors, tribal members, really anyone that wanted to have a say. And we worked very, very closely with Senator Ensign's team on this. And one of the questions that was staring at us on the map was the park is about 70,000 acres, as you noted, Graham. And then there was a ring of Forest Service land around it. And one of the, trying to be practical about solving problems, one of the issues that folks had brought to us that there had been some very bad floods a couple years before. Roads had washed out, and it had been impossible to coordinate road repair between the Park Service, the Forest Service, and the Bureau of Land Management, all of which were very, very close together. And so, we had a situation where I was aware of some of the history of Senator Reed's advocacy for the park creation, and that it was half a loaf, as Kai noted, but also that there were real problems to solve that the local community, the folks in Baker, were frustrated with. And so, being young and optimistic, convinced the Senator Ensign staff to come with me and have a community meeting in Baker where we put some maps on the wall and sort of opened a dialogue about possibly moving the park out into that rim, that additional 110,000 acres of Forest Service land. And well, it sounded awfully good and simple to me. That was not the feedback we received from the ranching community, many of which came in from Utah. I mean, there was a sort of a regional representation in the room. And, we stayed there for probably 2.5 hours and wanted to make sure that every person had a voice. And so um, at the end of that, it was fairly clear that expanding the park was not the next move. Um, but we still had a problem to solve. And so we workshopped the idea of moving that land instead of having three agencies, two agencies seemed a lot better. And so it was a little bit counterintuitive for a lot of folks who were involved in the process. But we came up with the idea of moving that ring of 100,000 acres to the Bureau of Land Management. Now, for a lot of people, that would seem that you were perhaps moving it down the chain of protection as the Bureau of Land Management. The BLM doesn't have a reputation for always having the most restrictive standards, but we were able to write into legislation language for that 100,000 acres that essentially made it just like a park, right? It doesn't have park rangers on it, but it has all the protections that come with a national conservation area or a national park. That land will never be sold. That land cannot be mined. That land is protected. So, I would like to think that the best days of Great Basin National Park are ahead. It is truly one of the most spectacular places in the country, and I think people will find it over time. And I'm excited that it has a ring of protection around it to make sure that it's not going to see some of the threats that regularly face other parks. And I would just say, I think by the time the conversation got to 2005, 2006, there was a lot of resentment over grazing allotments that had to move out of the park and how that was done. A lot of that was reflected in that public meeting that we had. But I think there were bigger issues at play for a lot of folks. The park conversation was brief. A lot of folks were more focused on wilderness designations around the county. They were a lot more focused on some of the conveyances of land to the tribal community. So definitely a different moment in time. But as a young kid growing up in Elko, I was sure excited about Great Basin National Park when it was created in 1986.
Thanks, Neil. Becky, if you could also reflect, I know, as superintendent, you also often have very direct interaction with members of the local community, county level in Baker and elsewhere. So, a lot of that creation process and the types of compromises that both Kai and Neil talked about, really kind of end up, in a sense, on your desk in one way or another as a superintendent. And it'd be great to get your perspective.
Well, thank you. I really want to talk about that, about three different people, well, friends of mine. One was Dave Moore, who I think is watching now. He was superintendent at Lehman Caves National Monument before it became a park, and he got a call in 1979 that they were going to start looking at Great Basin for a park or a reserve or a monument or something designated that would represent the Great Basin, which most of our audience, I think, knows stretches from Eastern California all the way to the Wasatch Mountains. It's a huge area, and there were no, other than the National Monument, which was about the cave, there were really no other designations of national protection in the area, and we needed it in the national park system. So that was sort of the basis. But in 1979, when Dave got the call, it wasn't clear where it was going to be. So he was going to work with team members from the National Park Service and also Forest Service, also Congress, also the Bureau of Land Management, also state parks in Nevada, to try to determine. And one option that came up was that the Great Basin National Reserve of some sort was going to be in bits and pieces, different units in different sections of the Great Basin. A second option was that it would be a reserve managed by, as Dave puts it in his notes, a committee, and he knew that wouldn't work. And the third was to make a national park. Well, I want to talk about Al Hendricks also, and Bill Mott, who was director of the Park Service at the time of the establishment of Great Basin National Park. But to go on about Dave, he always knew that it should be a national park. And here's a good example of somebody whose name isn't in the headlights, who may or may not be in Darwin Lambert's book. It's been a long time since I read it, but who did play a major role because he was stuck clear on this idea that it should be a national park, and he didn't wobble on it. But he's the kind of person that can make friends with anybody. He was very good friends with Shirley Robison. I know Shirley's niece is here among us, who was a branding inspector and adamantly opposed to a national park. And he was very good friends with the local rancher, very successful family ranch, the Baker Ranch, and had been from the very beginning when he began to be the superintendent at Lehman Caves. And they were both adamantly opposed, but he was the kind of person that could talk openly about his position and listen openly. And that's what I think Senator Bryan and Kai were both saying about Nevada. But in the National Park Service, it's not always the case that the superintendent can really talk with all sides of the picture. He's got some wonderful little stories I might be able to tell you, but I'll just read one little section that he wrote he's written several historical notes that are available and some that are buried in a historical, what do you call that, cornerstone that will be opened later on. There were always rumors floating around about the potential expansion and the designation of the monument, the Lehman Caves, in national park status, and a lot of the locals were not happy about the change. As soon as the decision was made in 1980 to expand the monument's 1 square mile acreage to 77,100 acres and rename it Great Basin National Park, the opposition, headed by Dean Baker and Shirley Robison, took an even stronger stand against the concept. A lot of locals were fired up and vocal about their dislike. A chorus of divide and conquer was echoed in local public meetings, and the opposition did not let down. The day Ronald Reagan became president, a congressman's chief of staff, Dale Crane, and a ranger, Mike Finley, from the Washington, D.C. office flew in and informed me that there would be no Great Basin National Park. I was later offered a job as the first superintendent of Kenai Fjords in Alaska, and he left Baker in 1981. But his stories continue to show that he still maintained these connections with Dale Crane and other very influential people. And as superintendent at Kenai Fjords, he conducted a tour for these very people, including Barbara Vukanovich. So these are things you don't know in the little books, but he made his mark in each of these areas, both with the opponents and with these congressional staff. He had friends that were just lowly employees and friends that were in high places. And I don't know how you would decide how much influence he had, but there's no question he had a lot. Al Hendricks was superintendent of Lehman Caves National Monument when this whole process got livened up again. And his part, which I think people really need to credit, is he was a very, very precise and deliberate person who analyzed the maps, analyzed what the impact of different maps would be, what different boundaries could be changed, and worked with the staff of the congressional offices. So they were sending him maps almost a daily basis, and he was responding. I'll give you one little example. Snake Creek is one of the major waterways in Great Basin National Park. Well, the map came in originally as a draft with the line drawn for the boundary in the middle of the creek. And it was Al's doing to move the boundary over to the other side so that all of the creek was within the boundaries of Great Basin National Park. And several of you have referred to the fact that Laxalt suggested a very small footprint, and there was a very large footprint that Senator Reed proposed. And as Kai has said, this got worked out in committee. And I hadn't thought about how Nevada might have been and might be one of the few places where people can still talk one another and work things out. The third one is Bill Mott. So Bill was the national park director under Reagan. He had been the state park director under Reagan when he was California governor. And Reagan wanted him, so he was the director. Well, Bill had been in state parks and he knew parks and loved parks. And he went directly to the president and said, I think this is a great idea, or whatever he said, I don't know specifically. But here's another piece that is probably not going to be written down. And I heard it from Bill, so I know it happened. I don't know what year it was. And then finally, as I think Kai, you referred to, or maybe it was you, Neil, grazing was included in the national park, very unusual for a national park. And that was to gain or at least mitigate the opposition from the ranching community. And it went through in 1986. Later on, after it was a park, and in my time as superintendent, the legislation was changed, amended to allow grazing to be discontinued. And then the regional director signed a document that said it should not ever return again to the park, but that's another story. Anyway, thank you.
Thanks, Becky. That's great insights and great detail. One of the questions, I mean, it is an extraordinary place, and I think we all have to recognize those who have been there. Visiting Great Basin National Park just leaves such a strong impression, in part because it gives you a national park experience that I think is fairly unique even to these days, of the ability to go someplace and not feel overwhelmed by people. I mean, all you have to do is head over to Bryce Canyon or Zion during the summer months, and you have a very different experience. So I think Great Basin continues to deliver a very unique kind of park experience. Can I'd love to hear from one or more of you about kind of what Great Basin represented in terms of that type of protection that it provided in terms of the ecosystem, if you will, its uniqueness. But I would also like to hear more about how kind of dynamics in the county, maybe both for and against the park. Some tourism, folks obviously being potentially interested in the park, others being opposed. And I know, Senator Bryan, you probably experienced some of that as you were campaigning. Perhaps you could touch on maybe some of the dynamic you saw in White Pine County, and then if I could turn to one of the others of you to talk a little bit about the uniqueness of this park and the types of ecosystems that are protected there.
To give just a little bit of the background, I mean, Nevada had struggled after the collapse of the mining industry and the Comstock, was always looking for some other industry to take place in the 1920s, the 6-week divorce. Mary Pickford, the great silent film star, came to Nevada to get a divorce. Senator McCarran, then a lawyer, met her at the airport, and then it moved on. With the advent of gaming and tourism, the dynamics in Nevada changed dramatically. Obviously, their mining had been big in the Goldfield Tonopah era, but that too had played out. So, in effect, particularly after the war, World War II, tourism became a focus, and particularly in Las Vegas, which was then a much smaller town than Reno. So tourism was an important factor and still is. In fact, Las Vegas, Clark County is more dependent upon tourism than Northern Nevada, which has, frankly, a more diverse economic base. And tourism, this added an additional dimension to tourism to talk about recreational values, conservation values. That kind of discussion did not occur, years ago. And I think that helped to shape, some of the dynamics to make this important. I mean, people, particularly in Washoe County, were very much committed to the outdoors and that kind of experience. Less so, but increasingly so in Clark County. And that helped to shape the dynamics in terms of interest in doing things like the Great Basin National Park and other efforts in conservation, which Senator Reed and I and Congressman Bilbray had a role in the late 1980s and thereafter. And I'd have to say that it's a national treasure for us. It's a great source I mentioned because I feel deeply about Nevada. Fortunate to have grown up in Nevada and shared some of the history of the state. And as a Nevadan, I'm very proud to have that national park. As we talked about a little earlier, uh, it's something to point to with pride, but it also has some pragmatic tourism. And in rural Nevada, I mean, to understand their frustration, I mean, they used to, as late as the 1960s, every county in Nevada had one state senator. The one man, one vote, obviously, from their perspective, disenfranchised them. And that developed some antagonism to the growing areas, particularly of Las Vegas and Reno. So that developed a sense of everybody is against us and they don't understand it. And people who didn't grow up here don't understand what it means to be a Nevadan. So that's part of the dynamic, the overlay here that's involved. That's that's changing a great deal. Washoe County is, in my opinion, much more focused than ever before on recreational values and how important that is. And Clark County is in the forefront of that today. But that's kind of the overlay. One needs to understand the frustration at rural Nevada. They've lost a lot in terms of the political influence and power they once had. In 1940, Nevada's population was 90,000 people. Las
Hmm.
Vegas had about 10,000. Reno maybe 24,000. Today, Las Vegas has over 1 million people, and the state of Nevada has over 3 million people. It's a different place, but in my view, some of the same values that made Nevada so unique in my time growing up in Las Vegas continues. But it's a very different place. And I think people need to understand, what was done by Senator Reid and others who have mentioned to express their strong support and commitment for recreational values and to preserve. And it's again now it's a question of water you know, uh, without getting into that issue in depth. I mean, Nevada is the state that has the less precipitation than other place in the country. And so the water issues, which in rural Nevada are very important for the ranching industry and in Clark County, in particular Las Vegas, water in the Colorado River, which is in a pronounced drought. So those are, and now, so in Nye County, you've got people that are talking about protecting, the Armagosa and that sort of thing, which maybe you wouldn't have had, but there's a sense that we don't want to lose that important part of our history in rural Nevada. So it's been a wonderful story. It really has. And so many people here that are participating in this program and so many others made it possible, but it wasn't always an easy push. I had some experiences in governor unrelated to this where, I mean, I don't want to go into any detail. Let me just say that as I was in the parades throughout Nevada, not everybody on the sideline was waving with all fingers, if you kind of get my message here. So, yeah. Anyway,
Thank you, Senator. I will, Kai did mention this book by Darwin Lambert,
Bristol Cone Pine, yeah.
and
Yeah.
it's called Great Basin Drama. Uh,
Yeah.
and it has some wonderful detail about kind of some of the dynamics in White Pine County,
Yes.
how
Yeah.
important it was. There were some advocates like Art Olson, who wasn't able to join us this evening, but who was a very strong local advocate, as was Darwin Lambert, who really, I think, helped, demonstrate that there was local support for the park,
Yes.
which I think
Yes.
ultimately helped bring it, across the finish line. I'd love to have one or more of you also just talk about the uniqueness of the park and the resources that it protected, if one of you wants to chime in on that. Becky, please.
Yeah, I'll talk briefly. I'm sure others can add. Um, First of all, the Great Basin itself is in a completely unique place. Geologically, it's stretching apart. The mountain ranges and the valleys are caused by tectonic plates stretching apart. This is it's just so exciting. Secondly, its dark night skies are unequaled, maybe equaled in Alaska, but they're extraordinary. So and thirdly, it's remote, and not very many people, even today, go there. The current visitation is 150,000 approximately. Aviva or Claire, you can correct me if I'm a few years behind. But when I got there, it was 86,000 people a year. And plus, because Nevada has so much public land, a great deal of the roadside scenery is without any commercial activity. It's just natural. So going to the park is part of the Great Basin experience because you cross over these mountain ranges and down to the valleys and over them again. And there's only a few billboards in advance of the little
Yes.
town of Austin and a few as you go out of town. And then it's just natural. And you don't get that in most of the United States anymore. So that's when you finally get to the park, again, it's remote. You can stand, you don't have to go to the top of Wheeler Peak, although that is extraordinary, but you can stand on many of the ridges, and see for all the way that you can see without seeing the light of a city at night, or without during the daytime seeing major activity, industrial or just towns. It's natural. It's not developed. It's developed in terms of the mining claims and the grazing and so on, but it doesn't change what the landscape looks like. Secondly, it's very surprising, but there are, I think it's 10, I might be wrong, 10 different ecological zones encompassed
Mm.
within the park. And as you go up towards the peak, and there is a road that the Forest Service built in their attempt, I think, to try to become a wilderness area there. And you cross through all these zones, and you can see the difference as you cross through them. You go from sagebrush, and you enter um, ponderosa pine, and you get into little stream areas with aspen. And as you go up, you get more conifers, and eventually you get to the bristlecone pines, which we know live at least to 5,000 years old, possibly longer, which is very unique. There are many bristlecone pines throughout Nevada, but not a grove that has been through so much stress and exposed to the elements in such a way that it has become so extraordinarily archetypically shaped and lasted for so many years. We have one of those in California as well. Then there's the cave. So, and there are many caves as it turns out, and they have been developed and looked at, researched, and there's a lot more known than there was even when I was there. It's extraordinary what research they're doing. The longest study that I know of rattlesnakes has been done by a park staff member at Great Basin National Park. global climate change studies are being done at Great Basin National Park for obvious reasons. Maybe that's enough. That's cultural as well.
Thank you, Becky. Maybe, we have obviously great number of people who have joined us who've been putting comments and some questions. Maybe Claire, if you could share some questions and we can ask the panelists to respond.
I'm going to say one other thing I meant to say before.
Sorry.
There is somebody who knew Marge Sill, who put her name in the chat. And I did want to mention of those movers and shakers who fought for the park, Marge Sill and her Great Old Broads for Wilderness group was very, very effective, and became actually friends with Senator Reed. And they've been active and have become Friends of Nevada Wilderness, and they're a powerful group today. But I just want to mention Marge's name. Thanks.
On the Marge Sill front, she was on the very, very, very short list of people that were allowed to hug Harry Reid.
Other than his wife, of course.
That's awesome.
Oh,
All right, Claire, go ahead.
Yeah, and before we hop into Q&A, just want to let you all know that you can put your questions both in the chat feature or in the question and answer feature. So if you all have questions that have come up, please feel free to send those in. I'm going to start with one from Stephen Moore, who would like to know the backstory on the inclusion of the bristlecone pine groves as one of the driving factors for establishing the park. Did the Prometheus tree cutting have an influence on the decision of making the designation or of citing the park back in the 70s and 80s? And if anyone might also want to tell the story of the Prometheus tree cutting for those members of our audience that may not be familiar with that, I'd open that up to our panelists.
Becky, are you?
I could, but I was looking at Kai.
I can do a not great job of answering. I think the short answer to the question is yes, it did influence. So Prometheus was a 5,000-year-old plus or minus bristlecone pine that the Forest Service permitted to be cut. And it was permitted to be cut by somebody who was working on a PhD, I think at the University of North Carolina, doing dendrochronology, and they couldn't get an accurate date. And so instead of figuring out some other way to get the date of the tree, since coring was proving elusive, they, to the researchers' credit, applied for a permit from the Forest Service. The Forest Service granted the permit to cut what was one of the oldest living creatures on Earth down, so that the rings could be counted up close and in person. And I think for a lot of people, it was a demonstration that the Forest Service was not capable of or committed to the sort of long-term protection that the place warranted. And obviously a pretty sad chapter in U.S. government history. But I do think it helped kindle part of the fire that drove for the permanent protection of Great Basin and the inclusion of the bristlecone pine groves.
Becca, anything you want to add to that is?
No, I think that I thought it was University of Utah, but maybe it was North Carolina. I'm not sure. But anyway, many people still reflect on it, and no bristlecone pine has been cut down in the park since, and lots of research has been done. I was afraid when I got there as superintendent that bristlecones might burn while I was superintendent. I told Al Hendricks, who was the outgoing superintendent, and he said, "Oh, they've lived for all those years. I don't think they're going to necessarily burn under your watch." But well, a few of them did. And that was a lesson in fire, that fire spreads through embers. And the bristlecones have worked out this arrangement between them that there's a lot of space. So they wouldn't have died if it had been a canopy fire, but embers blew into a few of them, not very many.
Okay. Good, Claire.
Awesome. We have a handful of questions about the current political climate as it relates to the designation of Great Basin National Park. So the first one I'll pose to the group from Robert Stoldahl is, anyone would like to share the impact that the current administration is having on Great Basin National Park? And I think maybe perhaps through the lens of everything we've shared tonight, or just outright.
And I
Well,
think
Well,
we don't want to make this partisan, but I would have to say that it would be charitable to say that the current administration has not been supportive of public lands and resources and adequate funding uh, for the park. It's so sad. I mean, to me, the fossil fuel industry, the you know, dig baby dig, has just eclipsed what so much of the people who are in this program and who are listening to the program are supportive of. And hopefully that will pass. But I think there's been inadequate funding for the Park Service and other natural resources that are so important to us. And I think we will regret that. Oftentimes, the tables turn, and hopefully the next administration will be more supportive of the things that brought all of us together here and that we've shared so much. But I think it's been distressing and frustrating, but the time will pass. Yeah.
Yeah, I will say that Great Basin National Park Foundation, in particular, really stepped into the breach in the early days of this administration
Yep.
when there was a little effort by the Doge team to try to root out what they considered to be inefficiency. It created a lot of, and this is my editorial, a lot of instability, within agencies. And I think, I suspect that there was a loss of talent even at Great Basin
Yes.
National Park. The foundation was able to step in a number of ways in order to help, provide some stability, which I think is an important role, and it demonstrates how vital these types of friends of organizations can be to our national park. So, I can't speak to what the current status is, and it's probably, quite frankly, very difficult even for the current superintendent to say that. But maybe Aviva, you can just touch on some of the issues.
Yeah, I think, that's one of the things that we can do as a park partner. We can be a voice for the park. So really the most challenging aspect that the park is facing at the moment is the hiring freeze. So the park is allowed to hire seasonals, but because of the hiring freeze and because of people who have retired, there hasn't been people who have been fired, but there was a lot of people, especially in resource management, that were afraid they were going to be fired and did leave for other positions. So because of that, we're about 30% down in staffing. And across the national parks, this is what I hear from all the other national parks. It's somewhere between 20 and 30%, is most of our national parks have that decrease in permanent staff. So, when you consider that it's wonderful to have the ability to hire seasonals, but you have to, train them and supervise them, and they can only be there for 6 months. So you're losing a lot of knowledge, and half of the parks management team is vacant. This institutional knowledge, we've had some exceptional people who have dedicated 2 decades to the park that have left during this interim time period because of what's been happening, because of their worry for stability in their career. So a loss of some really incredible people and incredible knowledge. And I think, of course, that also puts a lot of strain on the people that are left behind. But I think people are having the attitude of, keep calm and ranger on. That's what I like to think of with how to make it through and have a positive attitude. And I think the foundation is a place where we can be a voice for the park. We joined Hill Day last week in DC, speaking to all the different Nevada delegates, and having that cohesive voice between all the different National Park Friends groups allows us to really hopefully have some traction in Congress.
Nice. Becky, go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Aviva. I think that's the main story. I know all of us are aware that because of Senator Bryan's sponsorship and the votes that passed the Southern Nevada Public Land Management Act, Great Basin is in a better position, and any of the Nevada federally designated areas are in better position because funding, though there is federal participation in how the decisions are made about funding, the funding source itself is available. And Senator Bryan can add to this, but in other words, the park is able to conduct research programs and some activities through use of these funds, then other parks in other states are not able to do that. The second thing I meant is just that contracts also have been affected. So studies that were planned, it takes a long time to plan a study, and ready to go, the money was not released and the contract had to die, and the researchers are not available, and it's not easy to pick up again and do it all over again. That's another aspect. One further, if you're really interested in the full effect on the national park system, I put a plug in for the Coalition to Protect America's National Parks. It's an organization formed of active and retired national park employees with friends also, that's doing a very good job, I think, in defending the values of the parks.
Thank you. Claire.
Thanks, Becky. I think that ties us really nicely into the final question that we've received. The folks can put more in the chat or the Q&A. What lessons do you think can be taken from the designation of Great Basin National Park and applied to the challenges facing public lands across the country today?
Neil, Kai, you want to?
Yeah,
Want to go first?
I'll take a swing at that. I think there are some amazing lessons to be taken from Great Basin National Park, and one of them that I don't know that we've dug into today too much is William Penn Mott Jr., who was the Park Service director when Great Basin National Park was designated, and in the lane of one person can make a big difference, and if you keep working at something over your career, you might be able to make big change. When he was a young park ranger in the 1930s, he worked out of the San Francisco regional office, and he was sent into the Great Basin to find a representative place that deserved protection. And these were early questions, right? And clearly it took decades to get to the answer, but the Snake Range was the place that he thought was most evocative of the ecosystem. And we're talking about this 6-state desert full of sky islands, full of mountain ranges. For those that aren't from the region, Nevada alone has 300 different named mountain ranges, right? There's more in Utah and Oregon and some of the other states that touch. There's one of the southernmost glaciers in North America is on Wheeler Peak. You have the oldest trees in America. You have these unbelievable vistas. You have the night sky. So I really love there are so many people that made Great Basin National Park possible, including some on the screen. And I love this story among them, where he found the place, he believed in it. And as the story goes, I think you can sort of take two different lessons from 1986, which I would fully echo Kai's thought that I think that was a really critical moment in the history of Nevada, and particularly Nevada public lands. And that from May to October was really when they ran the gauntlet and worked out all the pieces and got the legislation passed. The election was November 4th, 1986. It was signed into law on October 27th. So there's a piece of me that watches politics today and thinks, in what world would, a hotly contested Senate race, Reed won his race by 1,000 votes out of 240,000 in the state. Like, in what world today could you imagine a president signing a bill or a delegation by, Republicans and Democrats working together to pass a bill right before an election, right? And I think Harry Reid and others knew that there was something special about permanence in public lands, about making that statement, about embracing that part of the American story, that could be powerful in lots of ways, including electorally. But as the story goes, it is said that the President Reagan was partisan, as presidents are, and was not going to sign the bill, and that William Penn Mott basically said, like, hold my stuff. I'm going to go talk to this guy, and got into the White House, had the conversation, made the personal appeal. The bill was signed. So, I think there's some beautiful things about the way we can work. People from both parties can see what's great about the state that they represent and come to a great conclusion. But I think it's also people that care a lot can also make a huge difference, as William Penn Mott Jr. did.
Graham, could I sharpen a word and drive it in edgewise for a moment?
Sure.
Yeah, I think the lessons, patience. The old expression was Rome was not built in a day. Sometimes things as complicated as this take time, take time. The other thing is persistence. Don't give up hope. And has been pointed out by Neil and others, building a coalition of support is very helpful. We live in a highly polarized political world, nothing like I've ever seen in my time. When I was there in the Senate, things were beginning to change, but we could work across the aisle and accomplish a lot of things. That may change. Basically, it's the voter that should look himself or herself in the mirror because they're the ones that elect our officials and they are just responsible for electing some of these people who do not see the value and compromise and give and take. And for many, that's a sign of weakness. You've got to fight till the bitter end. That's not the way things happen. I'd like to offer a ray of hope that I think there's some promise that things can change and get better. Most people that you talk to do not want this constant bickering and wrangling every time you talk to people, whether they're to the left of Mount Zedong or to the right of the Sheriff of Nottingham. I mean, they want us to work together, and sometimes it's the minority in each party that seems to carry the day in the primary, and that makes it very difficult to work out some of these things. But I think we ought to leave with a note of hope. This Great Basin's great experience did not happen overnight. A lot of people worked on that to make it possible. And ultimately, when it got in the political arena, the spirit of working together and compromise. And I was lucky to have participated in some of that with the legislation that I introduced that was of the public lands issues.
Thank you, Senator. Kai, do you want to
Yeah,
jump in?
let me just build on what both Neil and Senator Bryan have just said. And this will part admission. My first time in the snake range was when I was 19, and I've been going back ever since, on and off. And I could never, while I worked for Senator Reid, indicate that White Pine County was my favorite part of Nevada, but that turns out to be true. It was also the place, and this goes to much of our discussion here. It's the place where I learned that uh, the there's not really a political spectrum. If you do a town hall in Baker, Nevada, you learn that there's a color wheel, and libertarians and um, folks that are way to the left join up at the back of that color wheel, but they're all united, right? In White Pine County, I think by love of place that is really um, a moving and I think empowering through line for the community there. And that's not to say they were all in support of this or that, or they're ever in total agreement. But uh, in all the time that I made trips out there, both in my federal jobs, but subsequently, I'm just impressed by how wonderful the people are and how much they care about the place. And so, to the extent that there were folks that didn't love the designation of the park once upon a time, my guess is that the percentage of people that don't like the park now is very, very low.
I think that's right.
Um, and that's not to say that happens everywhere or always happens, but I think not all of the sort of worst specters came to pass. There have been challenges along the way, but again, the people out there are just spectacular folks, and I hope that their inherent goodness transcends some of the tricky political times we're in.
Thank you, Kai. Obviously, thanks to all our panelists, and also thanks to everybody who has joined us this evening. The comments have been great. We didn't get to maybe all of them, but I certainly enjoyed reading the comments as they came in. Appreciate the questions. And Becky, you want to jump
I
in?
just because you're saying that, there have been some comments on the Donald Curry cutting down Prometheus. The correct answer is yes, North Carolina is where he worked. And secondly, there was more detail by Louis
Provencher. Yeah.
Rivalge. So those of you want to check your chat, there's more information in there. Thanks.
Yeah, super. And also, obviously, thank you to the great work done by superintendents like Becky and Al and Dave and others, as well as those who worked at the park, who I think made a huge difference, both by being members of the community and by doing so well stewarding this magnificent place. Thank you to Great Basin National Park Foundation for the work you do. If those of you who are listening are not yet supporters or members or track the work that's being done, I would encourage you to tune in and reach out to Aviva and Claire to get involved as you can. So Aviva, I'll turn it over to you to close. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Graham. Thank you again, panelists, and Graham for moderating. This was really special to have you and to focus on this. And I think what I take away from this program tonight is, what makes national parks? It's people who care. And so I invite everyone who is in the audience, this is how you can be one of those people that makes a difference in the national park that you love, is, be part of the foundation, whether that's through signing up for the newsletter or following us on social media, making a donation, telling us your thoughts, thank a park ranger, come visit. So many ways that you can help celebrate and support the national parks that you love. And in 3 weeks, come back and join us again for our next program. It's just in 3 weeks. We're going to have the park ecologist, Gretchen Baker, who is, she's just an amazing expert on Lehman Caves. We're going to have the first girl guide who tell her story about how she convinced the National Park Service at a time where women really weren't particularly allowed to be rangers, first girl guide of Lehman Caves. And we're going to have one of our board members, Louise Hose, who is really the best known researcher, scholar on Lehman Caves. So to celebrate National Cave and Karst Week, we're going to have those three wonderful women be our panelists, and we're going to dive underground. So thank you again so much for coming, and have a good night.
Great. Thank you all.